So I guess we'll go ahead and just dive right in. What's up, everybody? This is a new book club, new and improved, revamped version of the book club. We took a little bit of a break off from doing it, did some reflecting, tried to decide what we liked best from our first two versions. We just got done doing an awesome series with our good friend Kamali Rose over at the Radical Democracy channel. We did Democracy Matters with by Cornell West, which was a great read. Lots of good discussions. Highly recommend people check that out. Before that, we did Matt Taibbi's Hate Inc. And we kind of mixed two different concepts. So we've done it chapter by chapter. We've done it section by section. And now we're just kind of taking it. We're going back to taking it more of a chapter or two at a time, kind of really digging into the themes that Hedges is discussing at the time. And we decided a great place or a great book, rather, to go for, because we wanted to cover Hedges and we wanted to do a Chris Hedges book because he's been so inspirational to both of our politics. Wages of Rebellion, just because it was one that neither of us had heard mentioned much, but really seemed to fit the time. This is Chris Hedges' book, really about revolution, about what it is to change in times of desperation. And because he's a dude so well read, you know, he's giving allusions not just to the Russian and French revolutions, but to Rome and, you know, the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian empires, and drawing parallels to what brought the end of their empires and what happened in the United States, and also how people like the French Jacobins and others staged successful revolts throughout history, and also how revolts can be contagious. So yeah, a good read and something that I think we're going to have a lot to sink our teeth into.
Yeah, absolutely. A great book to check out. One that I had not read yet myself, but I'm super happy to be in the process of it. I have your copy actually here right now that you left over at my place, but I think there's a pretty good introduction on the back. Actually, Chris Hedges says there's nothing rational about rebellion. To rebel against insurmountable odds is an act of faith, without which the rebel is doomed. This faith is intrinsic to the rebel, the way caution and prudence are intrinsic to those who seek to fit into existing power structures. The rebel, possessed by inner demons and angels, is driven by a vision. I do not know if the new revolutionary wave and the rebels produced by it will succeed, but I do know that without these rebels, we are doomed. And I think this in general is just a really interesting book and kind of interesting meditation on the topic or concept of rebellion in the first place, which of course is something very prescient to us as socialists or anti-capitalists. This question of reform versus revolution is always kind of hanging over the conversation when we talk about such subject matters. So I think this is just a really imperative text to tackle and to read, to get Hedges' insights as someone who is just so profound in his thinking and so compelling in his analysis of the issues which plague our society.
Yeah, 100%. And actually, in the introduction, he quotes this historian, Walter Benjamin. And Walter Benjamin once wrote, I guess, the role of the critic, like that of the rebel, is to steer the reader or the population towards the mysterious forces embodied in great art or in revolutionary visions. And I think that that's a really excellent way of putting it, because you know, unfortunately for, you know, practical reasons, you know, revolution is ambiguous, right? It's something that, you know, we all kind of have our own vision of. We all interpret what an ideal society would be like in our own way. You know, obviously we're pushing the ball with massive constraints, and we can all have a shared collective vision. But, you know, if we were all building a society from scratch, of course, it would all be a little bit different. And so that's why there is that mysterious force that kind of like compels all of us. But it's also, you know, has the spontaneity of great art, right? Like, where does the compulsion to write a screenplay or write a short story or a poem or a song or anything like that? It just kind of flows, right? I heard one poet describe it as like a faucet you don't have control of. All you can do is just keep a bucket around. You know, and I think that's almost like how revolution is. We all need to keep our bucket around, right? Because when the conditions are fomenting, when everything is really reaching its time, we all just have to kind of be ready. And of course, there are things that you can do to, you know, be a catalyst for that revolution, but it's always going to be something that is somewhat out of nowhere, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I guess we could go ahead and plow into some of the quotes that I thought would be most fruitful for discussion out of the introduction first. And I wanted to read kind of a block of quotes for everybody, because I thought that it kind of condensed a lot of what was kind of a lot of the ideas being tossed around in the introduction of the book that I think people who listen to this show might be compelled by. So I once heard Chris Hedges say that he was not a Marxist, but believed that Marx had among the most prescient and thorough criticisms of capitalism. In the introduction, he addresses the ideas of 19th century French anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, first by quoting the historian Adam Ulam, who wrote for Bakunin that he, one, never worked out a systemic philosophy or revolution or socialism. His socialism was mostly of a visceral type, the revolt against any kind of oppression and injustice, rejection of any palliatives or halfway measures. And I think that's really embodied by the anarchist ethos, as far as I understand it, which admittedly is rather shallow. But it was an understanding that any kind of state kind of forces compiling together could lead to oppression and injustice, and then a firm rejection of that wherever it arose. Hedges continues that, but Bakunin, however inchoate his own ideas about the new society, was at the same time remarkably prescient about Marxism. He warned that it would lead to centralized oppressive state. He foresaw what would happen to the workers once their self-identified representatives in the revolutionary vanguard took power. Those previous workers, having just become rulers or representatives of the people, will cease being workers. They will look at the workers from their heights. They will represent not the people, but themselves. He who doubts it does not know human nature. And that just stood out to me because, I mean, in a very diluted way, it does kind of remind me of the experiences that a lot of us had with the squad, right? These people that were supposed to be coming from working class backgrounds, those previous workers having just become rulers or representatives of the people, right? So we go from having AOC the bartender to AOC the politician in a matter of just years, right? Completely abandoning that ethos. Even, somebody who I still have a lot of admiration and respect for, but have been tremendously disappointed by, Cori Bush. She did not go in there and do all of the things that she came on our program and went on many other programs to say that she would. And she is as working class and as from the street protesting as it gets in America. And so even she was kind of turned into a politician. So I'm wondering if you do think that that's human nature and a rational and realistic critique of Marxism.
Yeah, I do believe it is a rational critique and something that certainly does happen, a phenomenon we kind of see happening over and over again, not just here in America, but in countries worldwide. I believe it was in Myanmar where the previous Nobel Prize winning civil rights leader became president and then went on to continue overseeing the horrific genocidal conditions going on in that country. Someone who had previously been seen to, be a firm and staunch opponent of all human rights abuses, after being corrupted by power, took on that role herself. This happens over and over again throughout history. And yeah, absolutely. We see it happening now again here in America when so-called progressive people get entrenched in the systems, get caught up and chewed out, spit out by the system. This is something we see over and over and over again. And honestly, I've said this before, but it's more neurological even than ideological. This is just what happens to the human brain often when it is put in a situation. It is forced to adjust. It is forced to adapt to its surroundings for the sake of survival, primitive instincts. And unfortunately, this can often lead to a corrupting influence, people changing the way they behave because of the influences around them. So I think this is something that we should definitely understand and, approach accordingly as Marxists or as anarchists or as anti-capitalists. Just putting people with our values in high places does not necessarily mean they will continue to reflect our values.
Yeah, I think what you said there is really spot on. It is kind of, it kind of goes back to our, primate evolution where we are designed to need to fit in with our group, right? We're pack animals. We have to be able to fit in with our community. And when you put somebody in a completely new space, that's the other thing that's the bitch about Washington, right? Is that you have to go out of your district and go be in a swamp where all that DC area is politicians and lobbyists that are on Capitol Hill. And those are the people that you're frolicking with. And those are the people that you're constantly in that echo chamber of. And that's, you're right. Human nature is that's going to taint you, especially as they put in so many, little things for you to try and seek their approval for and get, personal benefit from, and, having cloud on Capitol Hill, all of these kind of human things that a lot of us, want to reject and pretend do not, infect us, when at some extent for all of us they do, which is why we constantly come back to the socialist alternative strategy of fundamentally keeping your candidate or politician representative rooted in the class struggle of their district, not just financially, but through other metrics of making sure that they are one with the city. They're not one with the
Right.
yuppies on the hill.
Yeah, real accountability. And that's something that you're absolutely right. The socialist alternative in Washington with Seattle City Councilwoman Kshama Sawant, I think there's been a lot of really pioneering, innovative strategies as far as that accountability goes. We've seen other groups like the DSA not do as much to hold their politicians accountable. It's not like, the DSA is going to sit down with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and, read through a list of things she needs to be doing better or whatever. That's never going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of bullshit, right? Like that should be the standard for all of our politicians. There should be real accountability, because otherwise, I mean, we all know, people who listen to this show, you don't live in a representative democracy that's authentic, right? It's completely diluted and pacified, and it's, there's a million ways for them to avoid change. Just look at Missouri. The people voted that they wanted a Medicare expansion or Medicaid expansion, right? And yet the entire fucking state and congressional body and Governor Parsons has refused to engage with it. And basically now they're having to take it to court, to the Missouri Supreme Court, to try and force the state to give it funding, even after the voters all voted for it in a clear decision last year in the election. So that's just one example of how they will fucking stall the will of the people when they think it benefits corporations, because it's going to cost money to do that. In Missouri, obviously, money we have, they just don't want to spend, right? Okay, so that's one element of it. But it's also just, everything that people already know. There's so many layers that keep us from having an authentic democracy that we think that our politicians have come to think that it would be absurd for us to just be able to have open access to them. Like, oh yeah, once a month you have to come on a stage and for 4 fucking hours answer questions, and the first, however many people, go, everybody gets 10 minutes to ask you your question. You're there for, you get a 5-minute piss break halfway through. Fine. You come back down, you sit in, we call it the hot seat. All of our congressional, you have to answer to us, man. This is so exactly, it should be, of course, this is how we run our system. We should have had these kinds of things set in place forever. We should be like, still do, people would be doing it the old fashioned way, where it's like, oh, it's called the barn thing. Like, people would, this is something that makes sense. We should have had this for hundreds of years since the country started. We don't. And it's because they don't want your voice to be heard. They don't want your congressional candidate to actually have to engage with you. They want all of those barriers between the people and their representatives so that they can go off and represent the corporations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, but anyway, there's one last part of that quote. He says, Bakunin grew to hate Marx and Marxism, but he never offered much in the way of concrete vision to replace the capitalist state he sought to destroy. The anarchists proved more adept at understanding autocratic power and challenging it than constructing a governing system to replace it. And I think that's a fair criticism of anarchism. But I'm wondering if, do you think that there's a way to employ Marxism or much of Marxist, Marxist ideas of creating a new worker, led society, without falling into those traps that Bakunin is skeptical of? Because I think, as you and I, we commonly, when we're in the weeds, calling ourselves social libertarians, our libertarian values as far as personal freedom and sovereignty, I would say, are just as powerful as our beliefs that everybody should be taken care of, that everybody should have communal justice, and that includes housing, food, all those kinds of things.
Oh, yeah. And depending on how I'm feeling, I would even go so far as to label myself an anarcho-communist, which I think is kind of like the edgier way of saying a libertarian socialist. But either way, yeah, I absolutely think that you can kind of channel the ethos of both Marxism and anarchism into one. How exactly we can construct a society based on those principles is maybe for someone more intelligent than me to figure out. But as someone that definitely sees the value in both lines of logic and believes that, in order to get away from the current system of rapacious capitalism and overlords, et cetera, we're going to need to channel some anarchist energy, as well as some of the perfect social science of Marxism, or whatever people like to call it, in order to right this ship. So I think there's a lot of good ideas that a lot of different thinkers have had in this regard, and there's no reason we should, limit ourselves to one school of thought like some leftists like to do. They get really married to one ideology or one thinker, and almost in a dogmatic sense, they refuse to accept alternative viewpoints. I don't think we should be doing that.
Well, yeah, well, that's one of the things that I wanted to kind of feed this conversation into, because it does seem like you said people get married to Marxism or they get married to anarchism. And, I'm not married to any ism, right? I think that basically all of them have their flaws, right? Like, I don't really love the idea of like identifying with like one other thinker, like calling yourself like a,
Especially some guy that existed like 100 years ago.
Yeah, like, oh, I'm a Marxist. Okay, yeah. Like I wouldn't call myself a Freudian if I was in, I wouldn't call myself Lacanian if I was in like any of that kind of shit, right? Like I just think that you borrow from everybody's ideas and you make up your own ideas. And why would I just be a sycophant for one fucking person, right? It's kind of like what Ron Placone was saying. He was like, if you agree with somebody all 100% of the time, like you don't have like a role model, you have a deity or something like that. It's like.
Well, it does get religious for some leftists. They're like, the Communist Manifesto or Das Kapital or whatever is my Bible. This is the divine truth and nothing else is acceptable. And it's like, okay, I mean, yeah, there's certainly a lot of great ideas to be found there, but let's not limit our worldviews here.
Yeah, and one of the things that Chris Hedges goes on to challenge in the introduction that I thought was interesting, and something I would also challenge of Marx, is his idea that humanity is constantly like moving forward, and that people are getting more free and more liberated over time. And of course, from his perspective at that time period, that was happening. I'm sure it certainly seemed that way. But Chris Hedges goes on to point out the fact that there have been long stretches of like societal regression all throughout human history as well, and that we shouldn't dismiss the potential for that, because that's one, it's naivety, but it's also shooting ourselves in the foot, because he has the other quote about, gosh, I can't even remember what it is, but it's no act of rebellion can be moral without first taking into accountability the reality of the situation, because we can't deceive people into joining our cause, even if we believe it's moral and just, without while still deceiving them, because deceit is immoral.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good method. I mean, I could get a bunch of people together and be like, we're gonna storm the Capitol or whatever, or do whatever, and then everyone ends up getting arrested and nothing is accomplished, in reference to recent events. I don't think that was a very healthy act of rebellion. That could have been a lot more planned out.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I'm wondering, this book was written, I think, in 2012 or something like that. Obviously the societal conditions at that time, not great, still in the wake of the 2008 financial crash. He talks about the Arab Spring that was occurring, between like, I think it was like 2010, 11, 2013. We were, in middle school, high school, right around then. Not sure about the dates for sure, but there was a lot of uprisings in the Arab world. There was everything that was going on in Egypt at the time, and a lot of liberation movements that the United States then had to squash militarily. But now we've had another crisis. We're even deeper entrenched in that. We've seen the Bernie Sanders movement come and go. We've had coronavirus. All of these things are happening. I'm waiting for that revolutionary moment still. And it seems as though one thing that's not taken into account by any of these thinkers is, and maybe, it's Marx would argue, or people who like Marx would argue, that he calls them the lumpen proletariat. It just feels like people are so beaten down and apathetic and unconvinced that there's just not the revolutionary energy. It's sporadic, right? Like you had George Floyd, but there was unfortunately no way to, no channels prepared to channel, or no systems in place to channel that energy into something that was going to be more permanent.
Yeah. And I think that actually, and I don't have the quote here, but Chris Hedges actually talks about this really well, and I think that's something we see over and over again with people on the left or anti-capitalist. Part of the reason why over time people tend to shift towards the center or towards the right or towards what they consider more reasonable is because they do start off at this point where they think that revolution is necessary. And then over the course of their years, they become more cynical and hardened as they realize that the conditions are not there for revolution, and that, they're basically just sitting around waiting for this event to happen that's going to change everything, and that's not coming necessarily. And regardless of revolution, regardless of whether or not revolution happens or not, I think Chris Hedges makes a great point in the first chapter of this book that indeed it is just as revolutionary of an act to provide real, genuine mutual aid to our fellow human beings who are also stuck in the system, who are also victims of this system. That in and of itself is an extremely countercultural act, an extremely revolutionary behavior to take on and to perpetrate in our human species. And that is something we can all do in the interim, while we're waiting for the revolution. That is something we can all participate in and really get out there and help our fellow human beings. So again, I don't have the exact quote on me. I wish.
Yeah, no, I remember that he was talking about I'm pretty sure it was one of the priest guys that he was quoting. The guy was talking about it. He was like, "This is church." Because they were talking about all of the people that came that were young and people who were older and in the congregation were like, "Why aren't these people coming to the service?" And he was like, "They've already gone to church. What they're doing is church." Like, and. And I think that's kind of like a lovely way of looking at it too. Whatever, you do to fulfill that, innate human need for connection, like that is your church, right? Wherever you go to restore your humanity, that is, your church. And I totally understand that, whatever church, synagogue, temple, that kind of thing, mosque. I want to throw them all out there, Gavin. I don't know a lot about religion, so when we talk about it, I always feel like I'm a novice. But
secular place of spiritual activity, wherever you do.
Yeah, anywhere that you go to refill yourself, rejuvenate yourself, and feel like a whole person again. And there's this guy, Alan de Botton. He wrote this book called Religion for Atheists, and he goes on and on about how we can have, he argues that we don't, but we should have those sensations that people get from church in museums and in schools and in other places where we go to enrich ourselves culturally, libraries, places where we go to, again, connect with our humanity, to share in the collective human experience together and replenish ourselves, etc. And I just wanted to read one more quote from Hedges that wraps up the introduction, I think, really well for this book, where he says, "There's nothing rational about rebellion. To rebel against insurmountable odds is an act of faith, without which the rebel is doomed." And I just think that that's very true. But he also says, "I do not know if the revolutionary wave and the rebels produced by it will succeed, but I do know without these rebels, we are doomed." And that's, kind of very Chris Hedges for you, right? He also has that very famous line that he likes to say, "I don't fight fascists because I think I'll win. I fight fascists because they're fascists." And it's all about understanding and accepting and never creating any delusions or fantasies, as he calls them, about the state of things in the United States or globally for that matter. You don't want to create false hope. He says all the time, "I'm not in the business of creating hope. I'm in the business of truth telling." He doesn't mince his words. If he thinks the outlook is incredibly bleak, he says the outlook is incredibly bleak. And I think his outlook's only gotten bleaker since he wrote this fucking book. And trust me, guys, it's kind of a downer.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, thanks for referencing that Chris Hedges quote too. My absolute favorite Chris Hedges quote of all time, probably my favorite quote of all time, period. "I'm not willing to surrender every issue I care about to become an accomplice in this moral squalor and death march to extinction. In the end, I do not fight fascists because I will win. I fight fascists because they're fascists." And honestly, that's really the attitude we should all take as not just leftists, but as, people trying to do what is right in our daily lives in this cruel world, in this fucked system.
Yeah. And I think that, that's something that we can all kind of do, right? Is it's so imposing and it's so gosh, what's the word for it? Fucking terrifying to think about all the shit that's going on, and it's overwhelming and you can't fucking deal with it. There's just so much pain and misery and suffering in the world, and you're not being a bad person by not trying to plug into every single ounce of it. What you can do is you try and figure out what you're best capable of doing to help out. And then also, like Evan said, in your day-to-day lives, you just try and be a good person. You try not to participate in the bullshit. You try not to be an accomplice to the fucking machine at any opportunity. And then the rest of the time you just spend being nice to people, right? That's it. That's all you can really do, right? While you fight against, oppression and fascism and hatred and for justice, right? Seeking radical truth, as Cornel West says. One thing that I thought would be a good kickoff to chapter 1 would be to play the first couple of minutes of this speech that Chris Hedges gives on connecting the current predicament of the United States and late stage capitalism with Moby Dick, of all things, the Herman Melville novel, which, as he'll go on to say, was incredibly unpopular upon its release. It was not until later on during a republishing that it actually picked up steam and became known as the classic that it is today. But much of this first chapter is really rooted in his kind of connecting the dots between Herman Melville's drama and the current stage of things.
The most prescient portrait of the American and Western character and our ultimate fate as a species is found in Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Melville makes our murderous obsessions, our hubris, violent impulses, moral weakness, and inevitable self-destruction visible in his chronicle of a whaling voyage. And he is our foremost oracle. He is to us what William Shakespeare was to Elizabethan England, or Fyodor Dostoevsky to Tsarist Russia. In Melville's novel, the United States is given shape in the form of the ship, the Pequod, named after the Indian tribe exterminated in 1638 by the Puritans and their Native American allies. The ship's 30-man crew, there were 30 states in the Union when Melville wrote the novel, is a mixture of races and creeds. The object of the hunt is a massive white whale, Moby Dick, which in a previous encounter maimed the ship's captain Ahab by dismembering one of his legs. The self-destructive fury of the quest, much like that of the one we are on, assures the Pequod's destruction. And those on the ship, on some level, know they are doomed. Just as many of us know that a consumer culture based on corporate profit, limitless exploitation, and the continued extraction of fossil fuels is doomed.
This was an interesting analogy that he gives about Moby Dick, a book that I've actually never read, but now I kind of want to, because I always previously thought that Moby Dick was kind of just a metaphor for general hubris of man and all that stuff, and the quest for vengeance and everything like that. But the way Chris Hedges contextualizes it here and talks about Moby Dick is actually really fascinating. I think he makes a great case that it's really all a metaphor kind of about capitalism, about imperialism, and the way we all kind of get, stuck in this system, whether or not we like it.
Yeah, the way that he describes it, it kind of gave me a Heart of Darkness vibe almost to it in a way that I wasn't anticipating. And, I'd be perfectly down to do a Moby Dick book club after listening to this and reading this chapter, because it's like you said, it's a book I've certainly never read, and it's a book I never thought about reading, to be honest, until, he mentioned it, because frankly, I'm not super into those really old white guy books where it's always snooze, like Robinson Crusoe. I get it. People, if you like them, that's fine. Those were never the books that compelled me as a kid. I was more, I've never been into older literature. I don't know. I'm not smart enough, I guess. But Chris Hedges seems to know, he seems to have read it all basically. And he seems to know how to sell it to you. That's how you can tell he's a really good teacher, right? He'll take this really old and dusty book and make you want to run to the fucking library and get a copy of it so that you can sit down and have something to say about it and engage with it too. Which is just an aside, but that's a real mark of a teacher, somebody who really knows how to excite people about knowledge and make them want to engage with material on their own terms. And frankly, the entire reason we do a book club on this show is because of something I heard Chris Hedges say when he was on Bad Faith podcast, however long ago, when he was like, we need to do something to get people to read the text. And I was these books, that all of us talk about and engage casually with, but we need to really spend some time doing deep dives in the text. And he was like, if the people in new media want to do something about that, that's my advice to them. And I was like, you know what, fucking Chris Hedges, I'm going to take your advice, even if nobody else does. Gavin and I are probably the least qualified people on BreadTube to do a book club, but we're going to be the first ones to fucking do it. So here we are.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have heard that Moby Dick has some like really long passages that are just like describing the whaling industry and the mechanics of the boat and stuff like that. So it certainly is a little bit more of an inaccessible text, but if we were to do it, we would, break it down for you guys and go through it chapter by chapter and get rid of the stuff that has less.
And anybody can read it. It's free on the internet. There's no copyright claims. We could literally put it up on the screen and go down on our favorite passages and just like
read it like a play. I'll be Moby Dick.
Yeah, well, exactly. We'll reenact it live.
Yeah.
Argy! Oi, whale! We've got it!
We might have to charge people for admission at that point.
I kind of look like I could be a whaler. I'll just keep growing my hair out,
Well, I feel like ultimately, he paints this extremely bleak picture and a very accurate, but like we said, haunting and powerful portrait of what's going on with our society and what's led to this point. And I think that's ultimately why this book seems so important. It's like, how do we proceed going forward as people that do understand the issues, that have properly diagnosed the problem? What is it imperative on us to do? Is it simply to advocate for the proper reforms that might, lead us out of this situation? Or is it to advocate for a complete, new system to emerge, and what's the best way forward? Because obviously this is a bit of a failed state that we're in. Obviously, affairs cannot just continue as they have been. So ultimately, I'm really excited to see what comes next in this book and what kind of suggestions Hedges provides, if any, for how we should be conducting ourselves, for how we should be thinking about these issues, and carrying forward the torch of some of these more radical thinkers whose ideas we, are so indoctrinated by.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a great way to wrap this. One of the last quotes that stood out to me that just kind of like burned into my brain was when that same a priest, I think, that we were quoting earlier, talking about how this is their church. One of the things I believe that man also said was that we will retain our humanity only through mutual aid. And I thought that was really powerful, because it just shows that the one thing that we have is our humanity, and we get that through connection and through community. And as long as we keep that up, then there's still hope to continue moving forward. So as depressing as this material is, the one thing that, can combat all of that is the fact that, solidarity, community, mutual aid efforts, sharing the human experience with one another, because that's the most powerful bond that we have going forward. And all that shit sounds super corny, but that's kind of the bedrock for revolution. You have to have an immense solidarity.